July 22nd, 1944. 1647 hours, cloud layer at 10,000 feet, visibility sharp, sun dropping low behind the Apennine Ridge. James Holloway Burke was alone, trimmed nose high over northern Italy. His wingman had vanished somewhere over Bologna. Radio silent, no confirmation of kill, no sign of return, just a single P-47 Thunderbolt cruising at altitude, low on fuel, flaps stiff from heat warping, and instruments lagging from vibration fatigue. Then came the specs. Dots at first, 14 of them, altitude splitting, formation fanning, FW-190s. No question, no time for math, no chance for evasion. They were coming in waves. Burke's heart didn't race, it slowed. The math wrote itself in the air. 3 staggered frontal intercepts, 2 above, 4 flanking, the rest trailing. A net. Classic Luftwaffe kill geometry, deadly at this distance. He'd seen it rip apart Mustangs, and Thunderbolts couldn't outturn them, couldn't climb with them, couldn't even bluff a dogfight. Not like this. Not with a single damaged airframe and no altitude to spend. So he reached for what wasn't allowed. The unsafe dive. The one banned 2 months earlier after 2 pilots blacked out and broke their spines trying to pull out. The one mocked at every mess hall table. You don't dive roll a jug, they said. You bury it. Command had issued a direct memo, no dive initiations exceeding 30 degrees with offset rudder input. No exception. Burke pulled anyway. The nose tipped forward too fast. The Thunderbolt caught slipstream, banked hard, nose tucked, belly to the sky. His altimeter spun, his knees locked. The dive angle passed 40, then 55. The rudder kicked. The aircraft twisted, not a straight drop, but a spiral. Control surfaces whined. Airframe stress howled through the stick. Behind him, the first wave of German fighters overshot. They had pre-aimed the intercept path for a straight descent. Burke wasn't descending straight. He was falling sideways, on purpose. He didn't feel the fear, not yet, only pressure. G-force bending his vision, blood fighting gravity, hands locked at the edge of blackout. He held the stick like a blade. This wasn't a stunt. This was a bet, that they'd chase what they expected. And he'd dive into something none of them saw coming. They called him Holloway not because he was thin, but because they said there was nothing in his head except airspeed and ego. He wasn't reckless. Just strange. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't shout, but he flew like he heard music no one else could. Burke ran drills that made instructors nervous. Spiral dives with offset rudder, power dives with false recovery. Energy bleeding, he called it. Let gravity fight you, not chase you. Most pilots nodded, then laughed behind his back. No one wanted to fly wing with him. They didn't trust the way he pulled angles. One squadron mate called him the gravity gambler. Another said, he's going to crack that fat jug wide open and make the rest of us look sane. When the memo came down from command banning his dive technique, some said it was overdue. After all, 2 Thunderbolt pilots had died trying something similar. Lost consciousness mid-dive, couldn't pull out in time, wings folded like paper. The term unsafe dive entered the vocabulary like a curse. Burke just shrugged. He didn't argue the ban. He just stopped flying with a wingman. He practiced alone, low level over the Adriatic, sketching dive arcs that curved like question marks. He claimed the trick wasn't pulling up. It was never pulling too early. The dive, he said, wasn't about escape. It was about disrupting pursuit. If they commit to your line, he explained once to a mechanic, they inherit your danger. No one asked him twice. He wasn't fast off the deck. He couldn't climb with the stars of the squadron. His gunnery scores were average. But his dive timings were legendary, not on paper, on instinct. He felt closure distance like heat. He read German intercept patterns like sheet music, and he kept telling anyone who'd listen, straight flight is a lie they want you to live in. But they didn't listen. They watched, judged, mocked, and they filed him away under brilliant but unstable. Until the day came when no one else had a solution. And the dive he practiced in silence became the only option left. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a contradiction with wings. It was fast in a dive, almost untouchable at terminal velocity. But it was also the heaviest single-engine fighter in the war. With a fully loaded weight over 10,000 pounds, the Jug was a flying hammer. It could absorb damage, return fire, survive what would kill a Mustang or Spitfire, but only if you flew it by its rules. The airframe had been stress-tested to 8 Gs, but only in controlled climbs or level turns. In a dive, every inch of speed amplified force like a lever. If you pulled too early, the wings flexed. Pulled too late, and the ground met you before your instincts did. Dive recovery in a Thunderbolt wasn't about stick strength. It was about timing, and the problem was simple time compresses its speed. At 500 mile and up in a vertical dive, 1 second equals over 700 feet of altitude loss. If your blood hasn't reached your brain when you start the pullout, your hands won't finish it. That's what happened to Rizzo. He dove from 18,000, started his recovery too low, pulled hard, blacked out at 7 Gs, and never woke up. His crash site left a crater that smelled like scorched aluminum and fear. After that, the order came down no unplanned dives beyond 35 degrees without wing commander approval. Official, absolute, enforced. Burke read that memo twice, then folded it into his flight log and never spoke of it again. The Thunderbolt's dive profile was its ace card. No FW-190 could follow it straight down. But that advantage meant nothing if you couldn't recover. Command didn't want pilots gambling altitude for an edge they couldn't control. But Burke didn't see the dive as escape. He saw it as manipulation. He once said, "A Jug isn't a plane. It's a gravity engine. You don't fly it, you fall with authority." But the Thunderbolt's roll rate at high speed dropped by half. Rudder stiffened. Trim controls went dead. That made cross inputs during dives dangerous. One misstep, and the aircraft spiraled. That spiral was what they banned. That spiral was what Burke built his entire strategy around. The machine wasn't the problem. The problem was no one understood what it could do sideways. From his altitude at 15,000 feet, Burke saw the intercept geometry form like a net unraveling in real time. 14 FW-190s classic split-wing formation, 3 high, 4 low, the rest fanning out behind in staggered pursuit. They weren't hunting, they were closing. At 400 Mauer mirror, their intercept would hit his altitude in under 20 seconds. Any turn, any climb, any throttle punch would be predicted and cut off. They weren't aiming for position. They were aiming for collapse. Burke wasn't facing a dogfight. He was facing a pattern. And the only way to break a pattern was to distort its timing. He didn't look at his guns. He didn't call for help. He adjusted trim. He felt the resistance in the stick and watched the lead element split again. 2 dived from high left. 1 climbed right for overshoot. The rest were in perfect sync. But sync has a flaw. It assumes the target behaves predictably. It assumes a clean break or a predictable bank. They train for turns, for climbs, even for a straight dive. But not for what Burke was about to do. He waited. Let the closing distance tick down. 14 seconds. 10. Then, with 1 input, he kicked the rudder hard left, rolled starboard into a banking dive, not steep, just odd, and feathered the throttle for 1 second. That hesitation tricked the lead FW-190. The pilot expected a full dive escape, not a partial. He adjusted angle late, overcompensated, drifted high. The second FW-190 mirrored him, and now the geometry was fractured. Burke pushed the stick forward. The dive became real. Nose down, throttle open, speed spiking. But it wasn't a straight dive. It was a skewed arc. A dive rotated slightly off axis, forcing any pursuer to either match the corkscrew or overshoot. It wasn't about escaping. It was about offering an angle that punished pursuit. The German formation, trained to collapse symmetrically, now had to improvise, and improvisation costs time. 2 fighters lost alignment. One tried to match the angle, but slipped wide. The trailing 6 now had to reposition, but to do that, they needed distance, and distance meant delay. Burke hadn't outrun them. He had confused their rhythm. In the language of dogfighting, confusion is time, and time, at 500 miles per hour, is life. The first sign of failure came at 9,000 feet. Burke's Thunderbolt, already shaking from drag compression, suddenly kicked hard to the left. Not a clean roll, a dirty lurch. He glanced down and saw the flap indicator flicker. Left flap jammed halfway open. No warning. The dive pattern snapped into a spin. Not a flat spin, not yet, but a high-speed, asymmetrical dive roll that turned the cockpit sideways. He gritted his teeth, tried to counter with opposite rudder. The input came slow. The airframe vibrated harder. Altimeter spun down past 8,200, then 7,400. Too fast. The cockpit darkened, not from smoke, from blood. His vision tunneled. A deep red curtain began closing from the edges. G-force blackout. The Thunderbolt was hitting transonic compressibility. Burke's hand clutched the stick so tight his knuckles cracked. He knew what came next, loss of control. Blackout. Ground impact. It had happened before. He'd studied the wreck reports. Pilots didn't scream when they died like this. They just vanished into dirt at 600 miles per hour. He whispered a single word. Now. And pulled. The Thunderbolt didn't respond immediately. The jammed flap made the roll unpredictable. The aircraft bucked, then the rudder caught, then the elevator bit. The spin slowed, not stopped. Slowed. Air pressure evened out. At 6,900 feet, the altimeter stopped falling. At 6,600, the spin broke. The Thunderbolt leveled out nose low, speed high, but under control. Burke coughed, blood from a bitten cheek. His shoulder ached. He rolled his neck, blinked hard, refocused. The radio crackled, not a voice, just feedback. He was alone. The Germans hadn't followed him into the full dive. Not yet, but they would. He knew their doctrine. They'd try a second collapse in 30 seconds or less. He had maybe one maneuver left before fuel, physics, and fatigue made any choice irrelevant. He checked the flap again, still jammed. The left wing would resist any clean roll, so he wouldn't try a clean one. He'd improvise with imbalance, use the broken wing to force the angle, turn the flaw into a trap. If the last dive almost killed him, the next one would have to kill them, because there was no safe way out, only unsafe ways forward. Leveling out wasn't an option. Climbing meant dying slower. Turning meant dying now. Burke glanced behind him. 3 FW-190s had broken off from the main formation and were closing, disciplined, fast, patient. They were tracking him like a damaged animal, not rushing, letting him burn altitude, waiting for the clean kill. He felt it in their angles. They assumed he was out of moves. Maybe he was. But the idea was already forming, not a tactic, but a shape. He remembered the simulator diagrams, the ones he had drawn and never submitted. The dive wasn't meant to be steep. It was meant to be timed. And if you tilted the plane off-axis during entry, you could rotate your profile in 3 dimensions, creating an angle the eye couldn't follow. He'd called it compound descent. Command called it instability. He had practiced it once, over water, at altitude, with no one watching. It nearly flipped the Thunderbolt upside down, and now he was going to do it with one flap jammed, a tail rudder lagging, and no second chance. He didn't radio command, didn't announce anything. He just banked right 30 degrees while pushing the stick forward into a dive, and at the exact midpoint, twisted his left rudder full pedal. The plane didn't dive. It spiraled. Not uncontrolled, just asymmetrical. He could feel the stress twist the fuselage as air slammed unevenly across the wings. The jammed flap bit harder into the drag, forcing a yaw roll that no Thunderbolt had ever done at this speed on purpose. The altimeter dropped. The speed indicator maxed. The G-meter spiked. Every bone in Burke's body screamed, but he didn't black out. Not this time. Behind him, the 3 FW-190s adjusted late. The lead pilot tried to match the arc and overshot the entry vector. His wingman dove too shallow and lost tracking. The third began to spiral, then reversed and stalled. One by one, their chase line fragmented. Their timing vanished. Their sync collapsed. Burke had created a shape no doctrine could follow, an angle no textbook approved. He had done the forbidden dive, not in defiance, in precision. And for the first time in the engagement, the sky behind him was not just full of enemies, it was full of confusion. The Thunderbolt dropped like a thrown wrench through broken air. Burke held the yoke against everything his training ever said was survivable. The asymmetrical dive forced the left wing to bite more drag, while the jammed flaps screamed against airflow. His right wrist was locking from muscle strain. His knees pressed the rudder pedal with everything they had left. His world shrank to 2 dials, altitude and angle. The oil pressure dipped again. Smoke from the engine turned the nose into a gray blur. The dive wasn't clean. It was jagged. But it worked. Behind him, the 3 FW-190s tried to follow but lost their discipline the moment their angles diverged. One overcorrected, passed low, then climbed out. The second pilot tried to spiral match the Thunderbolt and found himself skidding sideways in compression. The third stayed back, circled, cautious. Burke leveled the aircraft at 5,000 feet. Throttle back, flaps shuddering. It wasn't a recovery. It was an invitation. They took it. The FW-190s regrouped above, this time smarter. They didn't commit all at once. One dove from the high side. Another fainted from the rear. The third held altitude like a hammer waiting to drop. Burke climbed, just enough to tempt. The Thunderbolt wasn't agile, but it could pretend. He swayed left, paused, right, opened a pocket of space like bait, and the first attacker dove too early. Burke waited, then nosed down sharply and rolled left into a downward corkscrew. Not as steep as before, but tighter, purposeful. He wasn't trying to escape. He was shaping the pursuit. The FW-190 followed too shallow. Burke used the delay, pulled a half barrel, dropped his nose, then opened up at the edge of blackout. 2-second burst. The tracer arc tore across the sky. The German fighter jerked sideways, then vanished into a fireball. 1 down, 2 left. He didn't have time to check his 6. Instinct said break right. He did. The second FW-190 came in from the low quarter, too fast. Burke rolled, clipped a tree at the bottom of his dive arc, pulled out missing part of his left wingtip. The German overshot, then panicked in pullout and stalled. Burke saw smoke trail out as the fighter dropped out of frame. Maybe dead, maybe just out. Still breathing hard. He nosed up again. Not fast, but enough to stay in motion. The third FW-190 hesitated. Burke saw it, the delay, the indecision, and that was everything. That was panic. That was a pilot calculating, not fighting, the moment doctrine breaks, the moment instinct retreats. Burke used it. He flipped the Thunderbolt left again deeper this time, let it fall wide. The spiral wasn't clean. The aircraft hated it. The stick fought him, but he held the shape. The FW-190 broke off entirely. The last of them vanished into cloud. Silence. Just his engine coughing, gauges twitching, frame rattling from stress. But for the first time since the dive began, he wasn't being chased. He was alone, alive. And the sky was finally his again. The remaining FW-190 pilots were trained for aggression, not hesitation. But after what they had just seen, hesitation bled into every maneuver. Burke had taken a band tactic and turned it into a disappearing act, and the men chasing him could no longer tell if the dive was escape or trap. The moment a formation begins to ask questions in combat, it breaks. The comms between the German fighters buzzed with clipped calls. Where is he? He's falling again. No. Wait. He's rolling. I lost visual. He went below the ridge. The panic wasn't a scream. It was uncertainty, stacking in real time. One pilot began describing Burke's movement as erratic. Another argued it was deliberate. No one could agree if the Thunderbolt was out of control or performing a maneuver they had never trained against. The lead pilot of the reformed upper element, Oberfeldwebel Krieger, ordered a regroup at 10,000 feet, standard altitude advantage tactic, but two of his pilots never responded. One had broken radio, the other was too busy pulling out of a dive he initiated 5 seconds too late. Krieger circled, watching for a glint of metal below, but all he saw was cloud haze and smoke trails with no source. Then a sharp flash on the valley edge. He dove instinctively, only to find it was a debris plume from a wrecked aircraft already burning on the slope. Burke's maneuver had shattered their spatial sense. The FW-190s weren't used to fighting an aircraft that chose to vanish into geometry rather than confront. One pilot even shouted over the channel, "He's flying sideways," another yelled. "It's a trick. He's faking a stall." The confusion spread. Two aircraft banked away and began returning toward the north, low on fuel and nerves frayed. A third reported engine overheating from aggressive throttle during pursuit. He aborted. Only 5 remained. Burke didn't attack. He didn't need to. He just climbed slow, defiant. A wounded machine barely flying straight. But the altitude was enough to make the remaining German pilots ask themselves a final question. Was he still baiting, or was he now hunting? None wanted to find out. One by one, the rest turned. None radioed victory, none admitted loss, but none followed. They didn't retreat from a plane. They retreated from what they couldn't predict, and that's how panic wins. Burke was flying wreckage. The Thunderbolt's left wing had a ragged edge from where it scraped a pine canopy. The engine temperature gauge had gone red 2 minutes ago and stayed there. Oil leaked across the cowling and streaked the canopy. The flap remained jammed, frozen, half deployed. His radio emitted nothing but static. The compass was listing wildly. He was 30 miles from friendly lines with a crippled aircraft, fading light, and no contact. Every time he tried to bank, the left wing protested with a metal groan. The stick required both hands just to hold level flight. His oxygen mask was soaked in sweat and blood. His mouth was dry. His left hand trembled. But he kept flying. He spotted a ridge, then a dirt road, then rows of vineyard terraces baked brown in the Italian sun. He had no fuel to climb, no flaps to control a proper landing, and no gear safe enough to drop at this speed. He cut throttle, let the nose dip, picked a flat strip between stone walls. One chance, no go around. He flicked the gear lever. Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. The Thunderbolt would have to come in on its belly. The moment the wheels didn't extend, he didn't curse. He just adjusted his glide, shallow, tail low, left wing slightly raised to counter the flap drag. The ground rushed up in silence. He kept one hand on the throttle, the other on the stick, one eye on the road, one on the wing. The Thunderbolt hit dirt at 90 miles per hour, screamed, skidded, bounced. The right wingtip sheared off a vineyard post. The belly tore into loose soil. Sparks raked along the undercarriage. Then silence. Smoke billowed. Burke unbuckled. His right knee screamed. He pulled the canopy lever. Nothing. It jammed. He elbowed it once, twice, finally kicked it open with both legs, crawled out, landed face first in gravel, rolled to his back, looked up at the fading sky, and just breathed. Italian locals arrived 10 minutes later, hands up, unsure if the pilot was German or American. When they saw the star on the wing, they pulled him to his feet and carried him to a stone barn. He couldn't walk. His wrist was dislocated. 3 ribs cracked. He was half deaf from pressure trauma. But he was alive. A British patrol found him 6 hours later. They asked how many fighters had hit him. He said, 14. They asked how he got out. He didn't answer. He just passed out on the tailgate. The Thunderbolt, torn and burned, never flew again, but it stayed in that field for a week before salvage crews arrived. Locals said children played in its shadow and traced the bullet holes with their fingers. One farmer wrote a single phrase on the side in white chalk. He fell like lightning. The debriefing room was cold, concrete, and indifferent. Burke sat on a folding chair, arm in a sling, ribs wrapped, wrist purple and swelling. The intelligence officer, Captain Willard, read through the combat log twice before even looking at him. Burke's answers were minimal. No embellishment, no drama. He listed maneuvers like a checklist roll dive initiation, spiral descent, inverted corkscrew, forced landing. Willard stopped him mid-sentence. You executed 2 full asymmetric dive rolls. Burke nodded, and at least one with engine damage. Another nod. You understand this violates standing regulation 22. Charlie Burke didn't answer. Willard set the file down and stared. Not angry, just confused. Do you realize what you've done? Burke did. But no words could explain it to someone who hadn't seen the sky fold in on itself at 500 miles. The initial write-up classified the maneuver as unauthorized escapes via aggressive descent. Willard wrote a line in the margin subject exploited aircraft instability for defensive gain. Another officer marked the page, subject's claim of enemy formation disruption, confirmed by intercepted chatter. That's when the tone shifted. Someone upstairs requested gun camera footage. There wasn't any. The system had fried during the second dive, but radio triangulation confirmed 14 German aircraft entered the engagement zone. Only 7 were tracked leaving. The surviving German pilots reported a distorted dive trap and untraceable roll angle. Their words, not Burke's. Still, command couldn't endorse it. The dive he'd used was banned after 2 confirmed fatal incidents. No training material supported its reintroduction. No diagrams existed to explain it, and no other pilot had ever survived using it twice. So they called it luck. Skill unrepeatable. A fluke. But the footage from an adjacent reconnaissance unit captured smoke spirals, twisted contrails, wreckage on a slope. One general at 5th Air Force HQ wrote in his report, the pilot may have broken doctrine, but in doing so, he broke the enemy's timing. That line was redacted before the report reached archives. Burke wasn't punished, but he wasn't praised either. His flight status was suspended for medical recovery. His Thunderbolt was written off. He was reassigned to a training post near Naples. No formal recognition, no medal, no citation. But 2 weeks later, new pilot guidelines were distributed. Quiet changes. Subtle phrases like dynamic, vertical maneuvering in defensive scenarios and flexible descent envelope under pressure. Nothing specific, nothing named. But the instructors noticed, and so did the pilots who'd heard the story in whispers. They started practicing steeper entries, adjusting rudder earlier, testing limits at altitude. When one young lieutenant asked if the dive roll was still banned, his instructor just said, officially, yes, but unofficially, if you're fast enough and scared enough, it might save your life. Burke never corrected anyone. He never claimed a kill, never requested a transfer. He just kept flying and said nothing. The manual didn't change overnight. No bold header declared the Burke dive. No diagram illustrated an off-axis spiral at 500 miles. But the question started. Instructors began asking gunnery crews if they'd ever tried timing rudder input into a dive roll. Flight officers quietly revised briefing slides to allow non-linear descent escapes. New pilots, fresh from stateside classrooms, came to the front already whispering about a move that could make enemies vanish behind a trail of chaos. No one taught it directly, but every squadron had one man who had heard the story. Every flight roster had one pilot willing to try. At first, it showed up in combat reports as coincidence. A Thunderbolt over Hungary rolled into a dive and disappeared from radar for 2 minutes, then reemerged behind a broken enemy formation. No kills, no footage, but the flight leader noted a disturbance in pursuit alignment. Another P-47 over southern France dove at full throttle into a ravine, twisted through terrain, and forced 2 FW-190s to overshoot into cliff face. The pilot blacked out for 3 seconds, recovered, landed, shook for 3 hours. No one asked what he did. They just wrote, aggressive escape pattern successful. Command never retracted the original ban, but they stopped enforcing it. Flight schools received new theory modules labeled variable descent timing under stress. Instructors presented it as theoretical. Students nodded, but knew everyone called it something different. The spiral, the corkscrew, the dive and drift, the dive. But they all knew the origin. And even if Burke's name was never spoken in the open, the air around the tactic carried his fingerprints. In Naples, where Burke was stationed, a new instructor named Fornell began drawing asymmetric spirals on the blackboard. He explained roll-yaw interaction during extreme vertical descent. He never claimed it was field-tested, but he paused long enough for students to read between the lines. One lieutenant raised a hand, asked if the maneuver had a name. Fornell smiled once, then erased the diagram. The next month, a memo arrived from the 12th Air Force. In extreme pressure scenarios, pilots may engage vertical repositioning if conditions meet survivability thresholds. It meant nothing on paper, but to the men flying, it was permission. That same week, someone taped a hand-sketched spiral onto the side of a battered P-47 at Gioia del Colle. No signature, just one phrase written underneath false smart, "Not fast." Burke read it once on inspection, didn't comment. But he noticed. He noticed that no one mocked the shape anymore. He noticed that dive practice increased. He noticed the language changing. The doctrine hadn't flipped. It had bent quietly, precisely around one pilot's refusal to die by the book. The Thunderbolt. Serial number 226971 never left Italy. Its fuselage, torn and warped from stress, was deemed non-repairable. It sat behind a stone barn near Bologna for 2 weeks. Wings off, engine drained, paint blistered by heat and fuel fire. The salvage crew arrived on a cloudy morning, said nothing, and stripped the aircraft for copper, bolts, radios, and wires. They didn't know what it had done. They didn't ask. The wing was taken to Naples as scrap. The cowling sent to Bari. The fuselage was left behind until it rusted into the dirt. Local children played inside the cockpit, spinning the dead stick. Unaware they were sitting in the ghost of a maneuver no one dared teach by name. Burke watched the salvage from a hill, his arm still in a sling, his ribs still sore. He didn't speak. He didn't step closer. He just stood long enough to see the wings loaded onto a truck and vanish behind dust. When he returned to the flight school, his name was no longer on the flight rotation. Officially, he was in recovery. Unofficially. His file had been flagged with operational deviation risk. He wasn't grounded, but he wasn't trusted. Not fully. Not yet. He was offered a desk. He declined. He flew check flights. He calibrated instruments. He walked the hangars like a shadow, saying little, correcting only when it mattered. The new pilots didn't ask much, but they watched. They copied the way he checked trim tabs twice. They noticed he tapped his altimeter 3 times before takeoff. Some mimicked the motion, some just stared, but all of them knew who he was, even if no one said it aloud. The dive he created didn't get his name. It got his silhouette, sketched in chalk, inked in notebooks, etched onto maintenance lockers. A slanted spiral with a tail line. No words, just the shape. It showed up at 10 different fields by war's end. Some said it meant chaos. Others called it control. But everyone agreed if you saw that shape taped under a pilot's canopy, you were flying with someone who'd rather die spinning than level out for a clean shot. Burke never saw combat again. He was discharged in May 1945. No medals, no ceremonies, just a shipping crate and a train ride west. He opened a radio repair shop outside of Denver. Lived alone, no wife, no memoir. When asked if he'd flown in the war, he just smiled and said, "Only when I had to." When he died in 1981, the box of his personal effects contained a single drawing on old parchment, faded, folded, with oil stains along the edge. A spiral. No signature. At Wright-Patterson, decades later, a group of engineers re-examining dive physics for vertical maneuvering found flight reports with classified terms like variable spiral offset and unstable controlled descent. They didn't trace it to Burke. They didn't know his name. But they called the concept ghost drop, after one note scribbled in a margin, the moment the plane disappears into its own angle. And that's how the machine outlived the man. Not as a monument, not as metal, but as motion, as shape, as memory flying faster than explanation.